Good afternoon and welcome to the January 21st Rotary meeting. Please silence your cell phones. Aaron Andrews is going to lead us in the prayer, pledge, and four-way test.
Dear Lord, thank you for bringing us here together today as a group who gets to serve our community. And we ask that you watch over our country as we transition to a new administration and help take care of all those who are experiencing COVID and help us get past this. In the Lord's name we pray. Amen. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. All right, now the things we think, say, or do: first, is it true? Second, is it fair to all concerned? Third, will it build goodwill and better friendships? Fourth, will it be beneficial to all concerned? And fifth, is it good?
Thank you, Aaron. As you sit down, don't forget the blue buckets. And also, we get a $10 match. All right, Tom, you get that? Okay. Yeah. All right, thank you, Tom, for your match. Visitors, Jack, want to introduce your visitor? Oh, or Jennifer, go ahead.
I have with me today Jeff Vickers. Jeff is Jeff was our first ever Dr. Harry the whole horticultural intern last year, and we're hoping the schedules will work out for him again this year. And he is also a big fan of Lewis Grizzard. So anyway, this is the top of it.
And I guess this friend, Barry Wolf. Barry is a corporate attorney that just retired. He's also an adjunct professor at Georgia College and Penn State, and looking to teach at some other universities part-time.
Welcome. Prayer requests. Are there any prayer requests? None? Okay, good. Don't forget February 3rd at 7:30 at Bojangles. We'll go back to doing the morning makeups. And also, don't forget to help Jennifer out in recruiting new members. We've lost a few from COVID and retirements and moving, things like that. So, any other announcements? Okay, Aaron, you want to introduce our guest? Go.
Okay. Well, today I have the pleasure of welcoming Peter Stoddard, and he's here to talk about Lewis Grizzard. So I'm pretty sure we're in for an entertaining session.
I'll start by saying, young man,
That's just this.
the name of my book is Lewis Grizzard, the Dog That Did Not Hunt. It's just a title that popped into my head. I'm was care to hunt. I might shoot birds, but I don't want to take down a deer. Lewis had a far more the hunter should, the deer should be given high-powered rifles to even the contest. And so I went with that. You'll see I've got on the cover. We'll get to a photograph. He died, and I could hold a puppy that's was on a Rotary website and seemed perfect for the book. A little Lewis, he was simply by virtue of the fact that he's connected. Google, which are Google's said today. It's a Lewis Grizzard quote. You ain't a lead dog, the view never changes. Let's see. We'll get into the slide. About the slides is I moved away. Stuff was I didn't. Language. Down 5 months, I think all along. I highly recommend a visit there. And he said, well, I think a lot of it's at University of Georgia, which would make sense. I was headed, and so we met a gentleman who with Lewis Grizzard. He was 25 newspapers across in the Carolinas, retired president of the region. Met with him in his office. And I said, has anybody written a book about Lewis Grizzard? Is anybody writing a book about Lewis Grizzard? Mark Twain and Will Rogers, each of those guys. And to the best of James, why do you suppose his legacy is right? He pondered that. And Dink sandbagged me a little bit, saying, I just tailgated. Just people who knew Lewis well got the stories rolling, and people to take my calls who would their voice take calls of some Georgia graduate. Else's business. It took me to Lake Oconee. Off subject, linear, which I did because well, linear's close. You'll get them. Originated our blood. Lewis had a passion for barbecue. So I said, why is my piece, the first Lake Lanier piece, about Lewis Grizzard? He wasn't a Lake Lanier guy. He was a Lake Oconee guy. He was attracted to Lake Oconee to participate in golf tournaments, fundraisers with Mickey Mantle. Longtime folks here will probably realize Mickey Mantle, when he retired from baseball, was kind of left out to dry, and he was a greeter at Atlantic City Casino, signing autographs and participating in golf tournaments. He didn't particularly care for it. He came down here and said, this is a whole lot nicer than Atlantic City, New Jersey, and I think I can do the same thing. He moved down here and hosted his own celebrity golf tournaments. Lewis came over. They became fast friends. And Lewis was also instrumental in a lot of fundraising golf tournaments. He had the Smart Ass White Boys golf tournament. That term was from Atlanta Mayor Andrew Young, who, when Walter Mondale was running his political campaign, his campaign staffers came down and told Andrew Young, this is how we're going to run our campaign. And Andrew Young famously said, they're just a bunch of smart-ass white boys. And Andrew Young had to apologize for the poor choice of words, but he said, but I won't apologize for the sentiment. Lewis and Andrew Young were good friends. And Lewis said, well, that's what I am. I'm a smart-ass white boy. So I think it was up in Big Canoe where he had the smart-ass white boys golf tournaments. Georgia, Florida, Jacksonville, St. Simons area, he had the Gator Hater golf tournaments. He was very philanthropic. And tournaments were for Eggleston Children's Hospital, which rolled into Children's Healthcare Organization. And Stevens, a couple years ago, Healthcare Network was a Sigma Pi fraternity and great friend of his and a roommate. He's got a chapter in the book. The greatest headline in the history of journalism. I'm not going to. And it involved to publish 80% of what but it was exactly very funny person. That's where yeah.
And I got invited to stay at Ray Goff's condo on Lake Oak.
Those started with William. In the Oconee, he built Lewis's first living. Across with and that, and they asked me if they could use my house for a casino. He'd go the next day and his furniture would be busted to smithereens. And Lewis would say, I wasn't so sure if I wanted to have them back because maybe the house might burn down. A jack of all trades on the company who managed absentee homeowners' homes. Somebody in Dallas, Texas had a lakefront, Lake Oconee home, and those casino nights would be held at the house of a person who didn't know he was hosting. And I told him that he was not as well as Lewis' friend, but everybody loved him. And they would have casino nights that would involve big mantle, Ford. I could go through the names, and the sheriff would be there, and then they'd have security outside. I said, well, what do you need security for if the sheriff's there? And my house was absent. He said, are you sure? He said, yeah, you got a key. Go, let yourself in. The covers. And he said, I don't know what to do. Started. To his drive. At the Harmony Grove Farmers. Notice. Okay. Okay. I'll just go through so that as a reminder. I started at an abandoned gas station near the track, and was his childhood friend, and they're able to his materials, and the museum now includes a Erskine Caldwell. So it's or whatever. I read them in high school. I think I liked him, but maybe he's not like this old textile. His mother in the textile mill. That's where his anti-host. Lewis spent much of his life trying to remove. It's a cruel joke. That's where I was like, you know what else? I could use mine, but I don't really do is get this. Yeah, or I've got a phone number.
Oh, that'd be perfect. Sorry, y'all, for the confusion. Get it going here for you in a minute. You sure? That's all right.
Sure. It is in textile mill, and it's on display. That Lewis's mom made for him out of his boyhood junk. Mine. This many manual typewriters is in there. A pair of his Gucci shoes. Just tons of artifacts, and I pulled big old Rubbermaid bins of stuff that they had not yet even inventoried or archived. So I'm sure there's a lot more there now than there was. There you go. I think you're done.
We okay there?
Yep. And yes. The first museum, the Lewis Grizzard Museum, if you can see the sign, it says Moreland, population 400 or thereabouts. It has not changed much since then. And that's the newer museum is the one on the bottom. I don't need to turn around and point because we got it here. This is Dink Neesmith, who I met with in his office. He's the gentleman. His son is a Rotarian in Habersham County, by the way, but he's the one that sandbagged me and said, I didn't really know Lewis that well. I tailgated with him, but he opened the doors for me. This is probably the most famous portrait of Lewis. There are many like it. Couldn't figure out who owns the copyright. The first folks to invite me for an in-person interview, referrals by Dink Neesmith, were Barbara and Vince Dooley in their living room. Their daughter, who is their business manager and social secretary, gave me a choice of 3 days. And the first was the Monday after Thanksgiving, 2018, in their living room. Lewis famously said, if you live a good life, when you die, you will go to Vince and Barbara Dooley's living room. So the daughter invites me and shows me into the living room, and I don't know when Barbara or Vince are going to show up. And it's this University of Georgia memorabilia man cave on steroids, freshly decorated for Christmas. And the Dooleys don't hire anybody. They do their own decorating. But I just showed myself around and took it all in, wondering if Lewis was going to tap me on the shoulder. But he did not. Lewis is cremated. Half of his ashes are buried in Moreland next to his mother. Half of his ashes were scattered on the 50-yard line of Sanford Stadium. But I had forgotten and refreshed my memory. Lewis got the black lab catfish from Barbara and Vince Dooley. And I asked them, among many questions, I toned it down a little bit, but I said, what in God's name made you think Lewis Grizzard was responsible enough to own a puppy? And Barbara just said, we didn't give him catfish. Lewis took catfish. So they had some puppies that they took to an event and in a wagon with a red ribbon around their neck. And Lewis was fresh off of a broken romance. And he showed up. He said, I need me something loyal. I need me a dog. I want that one. And that was Catfish. They had a really beautiful dog. They had intended to keep that for their son, but they said we had to let him go to Lewis. And while researching that, again, this is the Monday after Thanksgiving. So Thanksgiving Day, I'm working Thanksgiving Day, preparing to go meet my heroes, Vince and Barbara Dooley. One of the first of many coincidences, as I'm researching that, Catfish died 25 years ago, that Thanksgiving Day. The hair on my neck stood up, and Barbara and Vince, they didn't recall when Catfish died, but Lewis died the following March. That was the first of many amazing things. The next, I asked when they realized that Lewis was a genius, and Vince said pretty much the moment I met him. They started University of Georgia the same year, 1964. Lewis said, when I started at Georgia, they gave me a room at Reed Hall and a typewriter. They gave Vince a house and a car, but I got the better deal because Vince had to turn around a miserable football team. And Lewis, that's a framed column after Georgia had beaten Tech that he presented to Vince. Lewis is probably about 19 in this picture. I called my brother in Madison, Wisconsin after my evening in Athens to say, I'm heading down to Dublin, Georgia. This was my day in Athens. I'm heading to Dublin. My brother in Madison, Wisconsin says, well, then you've got to go to the Blue Willow Inn in Social Circle. So what is the Blue Willow Inn and why do I need to go there? He said, Patty and I were there and Lewis was there and he ate there all the time, and I think he promoted the business. So I went there and met with this lady, Patsy Jordan, the current general manager. She said, I wasn't here then, but the founders, one's deceased, the patriarch is deceased, and he's the only guy that met Lewis. Lewis had this in Social Circle, said, where's the best home cooking restaurant in town? He was referred to the Blue Willow Inn. He saved them from bankruptcy. They were about ready to close their doors. He gave them the highest possible rating, 5 bowls of turnip greens, wrote a column, put them on the map. Since then, Clint Eastwood, Helen Mirren, the Estonian Olympic team during the Atlanta Olympics have eaten there. They're closed now for due to COVID. I hope they survive. But Lewis ate there the one time. He did not live long enough to come back. And I called my brother and I said, he didn't eat there all the time. He ate there once. And my brother just said, my brother used to live in Conyers and around Social Circuit. Said, you mean to tell me Patty and I were there the one day he was there? And people left him alone. Margaret Mitchell used to visit that building, the family of the owner, before it became Blue Willow. So there's a Margaret Mitchell Gone with the Wind room, University of Georgia room. It is great food. I highly recommend it. And everybody sings its praises. A lot of fans are also, a lot of Grizzard fans are also fans of the Blue Willow. These are all 25 of his books, 20 of which were New York Times bestsellers. The couple that are paper thin, one is Advice to Newlyweds. And for obvious reasons, Lewis doesn't have much good advice to offer newlyweds. I did not interview any of his ex-wives. I wish them well. Out of respect for privacy, and I don't even name them, but he famously said I can't remember their names. Lewis saying he couldn't remember their names. They all ended up going by plaintiff. He asked one of them, honey, what would you like for your birthday? A divorce. I wasn't really planning to spend that much. A surprise. The recently departed Georgia Tech head coach, Pepper Rogers. You'll find a lot of people I interviewed were 87 years old. We just lost him months ago. Pepper was a star football player at Georgia Tech. The top photo is when he was a coach at Kansas. He led Kansas to their last Big Ten football championship. Then he had a few good years at UCLA. He was asked to come back and coach at his alma mater, Georgia Tech, and he accepted the job over the phone, sight unseen. And when he got there, he realized Tech hadn't improved the facilities since the 1950s when he was a star football player. So he had few good years at Tech. And he said, Peter, I almost made Lewis a Georgia Tech fan. He was never a night owl barfly with Lewis, but they were tennis buddies. They used to play at Bitsy Grant against Bobby Dodd and Bitsy Grant, and they would get thrashed. Pepper said, for a football coach, I was a pretty good tennis player. For a columnist, Lewis was an okay tennis player, but Bobby Dodd was outstanding tennis player, and Bitsy Grant was a professional tennis player. So they got smoked. They were both Elvis Presley fans. Lewis and Pepper were together on some beach vacation the day that Elvis Presley died. And it was announced from a grandstand that Elvis had died, and it put a damper on their vacation together. But at the end of our 90-minute phone call, I called him. I wrote much of the book at a friend's house here at Lake Sinclair. And this was one of several phone calls I had from that house. And this was Christmas week of 2018. He said, Peter, I'd love to talk to you some more, but we're having 30 people over for dinner. And if I don't help my wife, she's going to kill me. Please call me back. And I so regret not calling him back. But I was 61 at the time. I said, I hope at age 67, 77, much less 87, I'm entertaining dinner party company for 30. Such a fireball, such a funny guy. Once they let Pepper go, Lewis could go back to making fun of Georgia Tech again. This was perhaps one of the more famous columns he ever wrote. There's a few more inches of white space beneath that. Jim Minter, the editor of the Constitution or Journal, said, are you sure you want to do this? Lewis said, yes. If you can't read the fine print, frankly, I don't want to talk about it. This was 1984. Tech had just beaten Georgia, and this ran in Seattle. And pardon me? Oh, were you? Okay. This was my first year in Chicago. I moved up to Chicago. Anyway, this ran in Seattle and Los Angeles, and Jim Minter's phone rings off the hook from editors in that paper, and they're saying, "What's this about?" He said, "Don't call me. You don't pay me to syndicate Lewis's columns. Everybody in the Southeast understands what this is about." And it's been imitated many times. And it had never been done before in the history of journalism. Saxby Samlis was a referral from Vincent Barbara saying Saxby will have some stories to tell. And I said, well, I don't know that Senator he's retired, and he was with the Trump administration in a national security capacity. He's another guy that I interviewed from the Lake Sinclair home. He said, Peter, you got to understand, for obvious reasons, I've got to tell you a clean story. And he did. And he said, and I could tell you about my national security responsibilities, but then I'd just have to kill you. And, you know, that kind of humor never gets old, particularly from a guy that's one of my political heroes. He retired from the Senate as one of the poorest members of the Senate. He certainly wasn't on food stamps, but he didn't enrich himself. When he retired, he said, now I got to go back out and make a living. Really great guy. Frederick Allen, old timers will remember, he was a great political and business columnist who said he owed his early success to Lewis because on days when Lewis's column did not appear, Frederick Allen's column would appear and people discovered him. I said, my God, Frederick, I am one of those. He wrote the definitive history of the Coca-Cola Company. He and Lewis were not well acquainted. They'd see each other in the hallways, but they went to the 1980 Democratic political convention in New York City that nominated Jimmy Carter for a second term. Neither of them were big Jimmy Carter political fans, but they were part of the peanut delegation with VIP accommodations. And he said, and that night, Lewis and I and a bunch of people went out and hit the town. I said, all right, this is what I want to hear. I spent a lot of time in New York. I said, where did you go? Who were you with? What did you do? And Frederick said, Peter, if I could have told you that the next day, I'd be a better man. And he also was not a night owl barfly, and said, but we shared squeamish glances, friendly glances, and we were friends ever since. Didn't go running around together a whole lot. He wrote the foreword for my book. Jim Minter hired Lewis out of the University of Georgia when he was a senior. He was 1 credit shy of graduation, but Jim needed a writer, quickly promoted Lewis to an editor at age 21, editor of the sports page. When Lewis went to Chicago, Jim Minter knew he wasn't happy. He invited him back for a cut in pay and he was, again, a sports writer and editor. And it was Jim Minter that said, your hands are kind of tied here. Your talents are not being fully realized. Go write a general column in a different section of the paper. And Lewis said, what will I write about? And Jim Minter said, you'll figure it out. And he absolutely did. That's when his career blossomed. That would have been about 1978. And Jim Minter was with him his last day on Earth at Emory Hospital. Jim had offered to write the foreword to my book. And when I sent him the manuscript, he said, you've done an admirable job of telling stories, but you talk about a lot of the hijinks and mischief, which I kind of wish I'd been successful in getting Lewis to reel a lot of that in. And if I wrote the foreword to your book, it might look like I endorsed that kind of behavior. So I respectfully declined, and I reverted back to Frederick Allen. More 87-year-old people. Lewis's high school journalism and English teacher, Sarah Jane Skinner, taught Lewis journalism. H. Richard Smith taught English. They both recognized his genius when as early as a sophomore. Lewis had the hots for Sarah Jane. He called her Gypsy Woman. She was olive complected, very attractive, wore purple. You see, she still does. That's at her home in Moreland. It was Richard Smith that told me Lewis had the hots for Sarah Jane, and Sarah Jane just sat there and blushed. And Lewis had to behave himself because in that same journalism class was his high school sweetheart, who ended up being wife number 1. It's not like Lewis was going to make an advance on his high school teacher, but you never know. Sarah Jane used to be the last in line at Scott's bookstore in Noonan when Lewis would come annually and do book signings for his book every year, usually around Thanksgiving. And she said the last time she saw him, he stopped everything, sat her down, and said, Sarah Jane, I want to come over to your house, sit on the front porch, and spit tobacco over the front railing. I said, did Lewis spit tobacco? She said, no, he just tried to come up with the grossest thing that he could think of, and he never didn't survive to make that next trip. Emory Hospital, people might remember Randy Martin was the medical voice of WSB at Cox Communications for about 15 years. For surgery number 3, Lewis came in deathly ill, and people at Emory said, I don't want to deal with that patient from hell. And Randy was already quite accomplished. He said, I'll deal with him. And he shot Lewis straight, and he became good friends with Lewis. He smuggled in varsity chili dogs in place of bland hospital food. About 2:30 one morning, he tried to smuggle something in a laundry hamper, but the head nurse on the cardiology ward detected that and said, turn that hamper around and get it out of here. If you've ever been a part of a hospital, you know the head nurse overrules the head cardiologist any day. Randy fully appreciated Lewis's sense of humor. It was written that before surgery number 4, that they told Lewis he had a 50-50 chance of surviving. It was more like 10% chance. It was a miracle he survived surgery number 3. The 2 operating cardiologists and Randy Martin were in the room when they said, Lewis, you're just not going to come out of it. You got maybe a 10% chance. You're likely going to be brain dead. Do you have any questions? And Lewis said, I've got just one question, doctors. When's the next bus to Albuquerque? And Randy busted up, and the two surgeons who didn't have great senses of humor, they just looked at each other and said, does he think he's going to get better cardiological care in New Mexico? And that became one of Lewis's books, published posthumously. I never did ask Randy, why exactly did they call Lewis the patient from hell? Well, I found out at the Harmony Crossing Farmers Market this summer, where on short notice, I got a stand, and this woman walks by and sees the books, and she goes, oh my, I was Lewis's nurse at Emory Hospital during all 4 of his operations. I said, come again? She was the reason Lewis was a patient from hell. Lewis demanded her at all times. Emory Hospital tried to tell Lewis, Mary German does not live at Emory Hospital, and she's not available 24 hours a day. That didn't stop Lewis from demanding her. She eventually introduced Lewis to a second nurse, which reduced the complaints by 50%. She was at Lewis's side when they took him off life support. Randy Martin had power of attorney. They kept Lewis alive so that people could come pay their respects. She was at his side often. She remembered Randy Martin well. She remembered Lowell White well. Ernie Kane was the best man at Lewis's 4th wedding, still owns the Great Waters house on Lake Oconee, next door to Lewis's old house. They remember each other well, and they've aspired to get together, whether they have or not. Probably the last eerie coincidence. I knew who Lewis's sophomore, junior, and senior roommates were at University of Georgia. Senior roommate was wife number 1. He got married at 19. Fraternity brothers, sophomore and junior year, but I wondered who was his freshman roommate at Reed Hall. That's got to be something I can find out. I can't remember how this guy and I found each other, but a week ago today, I spoke to the Albany, Georgia Rotary at a golf club called Doublegate. And as I'm doing the research, a name jumped out at me. The designer of the golf course, George Cobb. George Cobb designed the par 3 at Augusta National. His first golf course design was at Camp Lejeune when he was a Marine. He designed Doublegate in Albany. This golf course here was opened as a 9-hole in 1959. In 1963, George Cobb designed the expansion to 18 holes. I found this out last night. George Cobb Jr., the son of the golf course designer, was Lewis's freshman roommate at University of Georgia. He is the executive director of the Senior Golfers of South Carolina. He and I have yet to meet. He is funny. This is another guy without whom the world would not know Lewis Grizzard. He said he almost flunked out of freshman English when he was Lewis's roommate. I said, you almost flunked English with Lewis as your roommate? He said, yes, he was my roommate. He was not my tutor. It was a very different role model. And they got into some mischief that landed them on Dean Tate's carpet twice, at least twice. And it was George Cobb that did the fast talking that kept them both from getting kicked out of Georgia. So without George Cobb, the world would not know Lewis Grizzard. We have yet to meet. He said if we do an event at Doublegate, he'll try to come down because his dad talked fondly of Doublegate. He wasn't that familiar with this. I texted him about this last night. He said, I'll look at the St. Clair, the Lake St. Clair Club. I'm sure it's in my dad's notes. I did a little Mark's TV show right at the beginning of COVID. This was kind of funny because Amy Lyle's husband went to Tech. Gina's husband went to Georgia. They're all rabid Grizzard fans. I've spoken to a lot of Rotary clubs. That started in late 2019 and rolled into 2020. COVID put a damper on that, but due to the miracle of Zoom, we're able to get things back on track. I'm District 6910, I joined Rotary E-Club of the South, which meets only virtually in September. District Governor Tina Fishling swore me in, inducted me. She lives in Lake Oconee. She said, I used to tailgate and dance with Lewis Grizzard. And I invited her here today. And she's active in the Putnam Rotary. And I said, did you tailgate with him when you were 3? She won't tell me. She won't tell me. She's just one of these ladies that ages well. She's got so many stories. Another gentleman I invited today is pretty well known in Milledgeville, Jimmy Childry. I first learned he was the first 2019 Talon Award winner as the most prestigious alumnus of Georgia Southern University. It was the first year they offered that award. Jimmy was a great friend of Lewis's. He has a house somewhere in Great Waters but I've spoken to his Sandersville Rotary, but his dealership was the first and only that could fix the air conditioning in a big, gaudy, stretch limo that Lewis had. And Lewis wrote him a great article singing his praises for that. Lewis had a Jaguar that he didn't like because catfish couldn't ride in the Jaguar. And he took it to Jimmy Childry. He said, I want a truck that my dog can ride in. And he wrote a column about that. And the punchline to that was, Lewis found out just how dramatically a nearly new Jaguar depreciates. And Jimmy, he didn't even mention Jimmy by name, but he made Jimmy sound like your typical shyster used car salesman, jingling the change in his pockets. He said, for one thing, we did the deal over the phone. For another thing, I never carry change in my pockets. But Lewis did not let facts get in the way of a good story. He famously talked to 738 Rotary clubs, was driving them nuts. Why don't you charge money? I think ultimately he might have ended up making a little bit of money talking to Rotary clubs. When I was at Albany, I went to the oldest restaurant in Albany expecting to find Grizzard friends because he knew the town very well. And I met a University of Alabama fan, this was in August, who said, I never cared for Lewis, but I hired him in 1981 to come do a talk to a Sertoma club, which is a civic group kind of on the wane that raises money for hearing. You know, the Lions Club is vision, Sertoma Club is hearing, and this was a fundraiser to fund hearing tests for newborn babies. But Lewis and Lauren Smith do some of the funniest 60 Minutes I've ever heard. Lewis had just been back from Chicago for a couple of years, and this was really just the beginning of his public speaking career. He was in rare form, and I just produced the CDs weeks ago. That's what the CD looks like. And that just brings me to my contact information. One gentleman already offered a Grizzard story, and inevitably somebody knew Lewis. And raise your hand if you ever met Lewis. Anybody? You saw him? Saw him.
I was at Georgia Tech, and they spoke, and got the hostile crowd there. It was pretty cool.
Okay. Well, and what's funny is I got some letterhead from like a Georgia Tech touchdown club, Yellow Jacket touchdown club, saying, Lewis, we know all you have asked for compensation to speak to our group is a six-pack of beer, but here's a check for $100, payable to, give it to your favorite charity. And that was about 1979. So that was early on. And
Maybe the same one.
it could have been. And it was an attorney who was just begging Lewis to meet him at a bar outside of that talk. But I would love to hear what Lewis would say to a room full of tech-alums.
Stand by sugar. What did you do across Yellow Jacket? A pig. He says, nothing. Just some things a pig won't do.
Yeah, I've heard that with a gator. I've never heard it applied to a Yellow Jacket. He borrowed so many stories from other people, and other people borrowed stories from him. It's just timeless humor. He was politically incorrect without being offensive. He was never profane. He a couple subjects would be off limits now that he joked about, but it's timeless. And what's rewarding to me is people say, yeah, my grandkids, age 12, go to books that we've got on the bookshelf, and they pull it out and they just say, this guy's so funny, where can we find him? He's been gone now for 26 years. And I just think his legend needs to be revived and carried on for generations to come. Anybody else? I will stay late rather than holding y'all up. If anybody has stories they want to relate, if you have questions, some people have not quite accurate information about how certain things happen, and I'm not so sure I have the accurate information, but I tend to have most versions of the stories that have been floated around. Thank you, Mayor, very much for your time.
And so in our club, we have a tradition of donating a book to the public library. So if you'd sign that, we'll put that in the
Outstanding.
public
I'd be
library.
glad to.
Greg here makes pens, so you can keep that.
Greg,
But
these are your handcrafted things? Beautiful. Oh, and this is mine to keep? Oh, my.
any last minute announcements? All right. Well, thank you for visiting. We appreciate it. Come back sometime. We're adjourned.